With the addition of the Factory Strider, we now have a well-rounded lineup of Automaton enemies. Now, how do these enemies match up against each other? Today we're going to compare all of the Automaton enemy types and rank them based on their deadliness and difficulty. Also, be sure to stick around to the end because I'm going to give you a couple tips on how to deal with the new Factory Striders. Starting off with the easiest, we obviously have the Troopers, Brawlers, Raiders, Commissars, all of the Grunt troops. I'm putting them all at the same level because they're basically indistinguishable from each other. They all go down in a couple hits and they're really not that difficult. The only distinction I'll make is for the Rocket Raiders. Those guys can really hit you the worst moment and they do a lot of damage, otherwise most of these guys are just cannon fodder. Next we have the Scout Striders. These guys are definitely a big jump in difficulty, however this is mostly because they do have a significant amount of firepower, especially at the higher difficulties. If you run straight into a couple of these guys and you don't have a grenade and you can't maneuver behind them, you could be in trouble because they can take you out pretty quickly. But if you play it smart, they're not too difficult. Next up we have the Berserkers. While their meat saws are pretty imposing and their general demeanor is not too great, if you can keep them at range, they're pretty manageable. Now they do have quite a bit of health, so it can be a little bit of a struggle to take them down before they get in swinging range, but if you can keep your distance, they're not too bad. You can't ignore them, but they're not your biggest concern. Next up we're going to look at the Devastators, and because there's variations of this troop, the difficulty can vary wildly. The easiest are definitely going to be the standard Devastators. They are only equipped with regular cannons and a couple of headshots can take them down pretty quickly at close range. They can still be dangerous, but they aren't really a major concern. In fact, I would probably rank them closer to Berserkers in terms of difficulty. The Heavy Devastator though is significantly more difficult. Their laser machine guns and shields can be an absolute challenge at close range and long range. They are very weak to headshots, but at longer ranges their shield makes that difficult, especially since these guys spawn in bigger groups at higher difficulties. It doesn't help that they're pretty accurate with the laser machine gun at any range. Lastly, we have the Rocket Devastators, and they wouldn't be so bad except they can one-shot you across the map. Like the rest of the Devastators, they're pretty weak to headshots at close range, and you can also take out their rocket launchers, but until you do that, at any range, you are a valid target for them. They're definitely something you need to keep your eye on, and their rocket salvo can be brutal sometimes. Next, and this might be a little bit controversial, I'm actually putting the Tank. Now the tanks do have an impressive amount of firepower, but I feel that they can be fairly easily evaded or destroyed. Now they do have quite a bit of armor on the main tank body, but the upper turret is actually pretty weak. In fact, a single Quasar shot and an impact grenade can take out a tank if you target the gun turret. Now I wouldn't exactly call them easy, but I feel like they're fairly manageable. They're definitely not something I want to run into one-on-one, but in general in a large combat scenario, I'm not too concerned about them. Next up is the Hulk, and these guys really are awful, and that's mostly because they have limited weak spots and they're really fast. Obviously the glowing vents on their back are weak to most damage, but it can be really difficult to maneuver yourself behind the Hulks, especially if they have the flamethrower. Not to mention, fire kills you almost instantly. Now, technically their eye is weak too, but in my experience it is almost impossible to reliably hit it. I know the anti-tank rifle is one of the weapons that can technically kill them really fast if you're hitting your shots on the eye, but that's in practice not that easy. The only reliable way to kill them quickly is to hit them in the rear vent, and that can be a challenge sometimes. Now if you're using heavy weaponry, you can blow off the arms in one hit if you're using something like the Quasar cannon. That can be a big help. But the biggest problem with these guys is that they're really fast, really armored, and they have a lot of firepower. And finally, the hardest enemy right now is obviously going to be the Factory Strider. These things have an absolutely insane amount of firepower they can put out. The main turret does heavy explosive damage, and the machine guns can shred you at full health in just a couple of seconds. Technically the only weak spot they have is actually underneath on the bay doors, but that's also where they drop Devastators, so that's something to be mindful of. You really don't want to get caught underneath a Strider when it's dropping Devastators. And to round that all off with their thick armor and insane amount of health, they are a formidable enemy. Now before I give you those tips on taking down the Factory Striders, I just want to congratulate everyone for surviving this far into the Automaton invasion. Here's a medal. Good job. Anyways, if you are looking for a couple ways to even the odds against the Factory Striders, here are a couple things to keep in mind. Technically, the Quasar can two-shot a Factory Strider to specific spots on its side. Now, I haven't personally been able to do this, so I wouldn't really recommend it. I don't know how reliable this is. Now, continuing to use the Quasar as a reference, the head can take 6 shots, the main turret can take 2, and the minigun turrets are usually 1 shot each. Now, like I said earlier, if you can get underneath the Strider, you can two-shot the bay doors. However, this is a little bit of a risky strat. Realistically, you're going to need some serious firepower to deal with these guys though. The 500 kilogram bomb can one-hit it if it is a direct impact to the head. This is difficult to pull off, but it is nice to know. Other heavy stratagems like the railgun are typically going to take 2 shots. They might be good for finishing it off, but don't expect it to one-shot it on its own. Anyways, let me know what you guys think of the Factory Striders. Do you love them? Do you hate them? Do you like the dynamic they add to the game? So far, I think they're a fun challenge, although I'll admit the Automatons don't really need any additional challenges. Also, I'm not totally sure how I feel about them being derivative of objectively the best Star Wars movie. Anyways, if you found this helpful, please subscribe, I really appreciate that. Helps me pay my kids' orphanage bills. If anyone gets that reference, I'll make you another medal for that.